So before I get started, I thought I might mention something that's going to happen tonight around dark. And that is, it's the beginning of the Jewish festival of Sukkot. And one of the traditions there is that you don't eat inside, but you eat out in a tent. And so we didn't actually plan to observe the holiday, but it's going to turn out that way. Anyway, so I hope to see many of you there. "1990 was the year my old religion stopped working. That was 22 years ago now. It's hard to remember. Have you ever been through a mind shift where one day something was true and the next it might still be there, but the question had shifted? And the old answers just weren't relevant anymore? I can't say I've really ever told anyone this before, but at the time I was an engineer at RCA in Princeton, New Jersey, working for the Television Research Laboratory, actually working on the video disc system. And most weekdays, the group that I worked with had lunch together. We all sat at one particular table in the cafeteria. It was sort of like high school, only it was a lot friendlier than that. And they were paying us, actually. That was another nice thing. But anyway, on Mondays, the topic was often, how was your weekend? And from April to November, my boss, a guy named John Henderson, would usually report that he and his wife, Nancy, had been down to Cape May. And then he might say something like, well, the church had a rummage sale and Nancy ran the toys table or something like that. Anyway, I have to admit, Cape May seemed really far away to me at the time, and stories of rummage sales only vaguely triggered memories of the Winchester Unitarian Society up near Boston, where I would help out occasionally with a church bazaar when I was a kid. And I would check in on Mondays saying something like, well, I went up to Round Valley or up to Spruce Run. And another coworker, who was also my next door neighbor, would be a little bit more evangelical. Jeremy might say something like that he'd gone to Tom's River or to Seaside, or maybe even taken a few days off and flown to Oregon. He'd come back transformed. There was no use saying any more. The folks at the table didn't really understand us. But if it was a clear and warm day, and there was at least a moderately strong breeze, I would strap my windsurfer on the roof of my minivan, and about an hour later, I would be at the lake or at the beach. And then for an hour or so, I'd go zipping around, twisting and turning, leaning way back as the wind carried me faster than a speedboat, skimming the surface of the water. It was transformative, and it was heavenly. Now, John hadn't told the group that he'd spent several hours after the rummage sale windsurfing around the inlet and the canal. But sometimes in private, he'd tell Jeremy and me about it, and we'd ask, how was the wind? Jeremy would go to a particular gorge on the Columbia River, and which is on the border between Oregon and Washington, where the wind, or he called it, as he would call it, the W, was always perfect. And the community there was full of supportive windsurfing folks, or board sailors, as they're more correctly called. And then one day, it stopped working. I mean, I still had the equipment, and in fact, it's still up in my garage up in Kingston, New Jersey, but and I went out sailing now and again, but it just wasn't the same. Things had shifted. Now, when I was a kid, I was a rather geeky kid, as you might guess, and I was part of a Unitarian Universalist youth group called Liberal Religious Youth. In addition to meeting at the church in Winchester, we'd have conferences around New England with all-night discussions about alternative religions or peace activism or macrobiotic cooking or who knows what. At the time, I was very much a Unitarian Universalist and very involved until I went off to college. For some reason, my fraternity attracted folks from lots of different religions. And while I wasn't one of the ones who woke up early Sunday morning to go off to church, our religious practice was to go play ping pong. And there was a couch next to it, and we'd have these long discussions about religion and lack thereof, and it was really fascinating. Then during the summer of my first college year, that was 1978, I worked at an old Universalist camp called Ferry Beach up in Maine. The Vietnam War was still going on, and I had applied for conscientious objector status. Unitarian Universalism had given me the grounding to write the application, and just before my birthday in July, I got my draft card with 1AO status on it. That's a conscientious objector classification. And because I had a high draft lottery number, I was never called up. The war was winding down, and I didn't become part of a conscientious objector group or a peace activist group or anything. Life went on, and I started worrying about engineering instead. By 1990, my religion was me and nature. It was a very able-bodied religion. Hiking in the springtime, cross-country skiing in the winter, windsurfing and board sailing or board sailing more properly called, in the summer and in the fall. Sometimes with other people, sometimes by myself. It was enough. Perhaps I was gathering those fragments, as Sarah Morse Campbell writes. We receive fragments of holiness, glimpses of eternity, brief moments of insight. Let us gather them up for the precious gifts that they are, and, renewed by grace, move boldly into the unknown. But if I was gathering, and if I was being renewed, I wasn't moving. I was in a rut. It was a really pleasant rut. But then in 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the United States started gearing up to go to war. Some of you might remember that year. It was very interesting because the rhetoric on TV and on National Public Radio, too, became very much what we had to do. It ceased being debate and started being instruction. But I wasn't sure. I wanted to hear not doctrine, but discussion. Not one voice, but many voices. So, listening to the radio each morning was not the place that I was getting a variety of voices. I wasn't getting the discussion that I remembered from LRY, that I remembered from other things in my youth, or even from my college fraternity. And the windsurfing beaches didn't give it to me either. In 1990, I came back to Unitarian Universalism. I came back because I didn't know what to think. I didn't know how to feel. And I couldn't change alone. Now, the Kentucky essayist and poet Wendell Berry writes, "It may be when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we've come to our real journey." It took a war to wake me out of myself. It took the fear of others dying, the fear of others killing, to reconnect me with a fragment from my youth. And it took a liberal faith, one which gave me roots and wings, rather than lectures about hell, a liberal faith that allowed me to choose to return. Now, the symbol of the flaming chalice reminds me of this process. When the Unitarian Service Committee first developed the symbol during World War II, it was a narrow cup, like a communion cup, with a flame coming out of it. But when Universalists and Unitarians merged, they created a new symbol. They surrounded it by two rings which were offset from each other so that there was no single center. And then offset from that, there was a chalice which had a broadened lip. But the flame stayed the same. When I see this, I think of a Greek Chalice or Salix. It's a drinking bowl which had a very wide top. They made it that way so that the wine could breathe. Actually, I think the wine that they made in Greece in that day were really dark red. And if you had it in a narrow cup and you tried to drink it, you would probably inhale the vapors and who knows, it would be a mess. But the good news was this was a very broad brim and it had lots of different places where you could put your lips. So it was kind of like, if the last guy had done sort of left stuff on the thing, pass it person to person. It ends up being kind of cool. But that concept of sharing a bowl of wine, essentially, impressed me. The flame stayed the same, even though the top of the chalice became wide. It's there, but it isn't like you're drinking Bananas Foster or Baked Alaska or something. It doesn't have a gigantic flambe feel to it. It's just a flame. The flame isn't the centerpiece. It's there to illuminate the chalice and to illuminate the sharing as we gather moments of insight. It's a beacon to call us to our best selves. I invite you to think back into your own life. Think about not so much the crises, but rather places in your life where the questions shifted. Where you went from concerning yourself with the equivalent of windsurfing to the equivalent of working with for something else. Finding your own real work. And I'm mindful that what had been real work for you at one point may have stopped working. And that real journeys can turn into rutted roads. And for some of you today, probably you still don't know what to do. You don't know which way to go. The 13th century Muslim Sufi poet Rumi writes, "Come, take a pickaxe and break apart your stony self, batter down the door, unstop the wine jar, smash the jug, and come to the river. You're the only one who can break apart your stony self, smashing old habits and finding new ways. Well, maybe with some help from your friends." Today is actually the anniversary of John Murray saying those words that were in our reading this morning. Give them not hell, but hope and courage. He gave that sermon in 1770, on September the 30th, at a place just a couple of miles away from a really good windsurfing spot in Tom's River. And some of you know the legend, but here's just a simple fact from it. 1 week earlier, on September 23rd perhaps, John Murray was nothing but a failure. A Methodist lay preacher who had become convinced that all persons were loved eternally by God. A doctrine which had lost him his job and sent him to America from England, a broken man. John Murray could not, would not, and did not even dream of delivering a sermon ever again for the rest of his life. And then the question shifted. And he answered, yes. I was an engineer, and I was not one of those children who secretly had a shoebox under my bed, which I would pull out with little painted tin congregants that I set up and little pulpit. I didn't have the slightest idea that I was going to become a minister, really. That, mind you, I actually don't know any ministers who did play with tin congregants as children, but I was not one of those. Ministry wasn't really the answer. It wasn't even part of the question until about 2001, after September 11th, or probably more like 2002. But things shift. And thank goodness for community being present to help, to hold, and occasionally to hug. A bit over 5 years ago, I'd been laid off from my old RCA job. A few years before that, I came out as gay. And that had shifted the answers to some of the questions. But just over 5 years ago, I decided that shifting answers wasn't enough. I wanted to shift the questions. And so I went off to page 7, which is missing. There it is. Fortunately, it's a California thing, so we can all be mellow about it. To start King's School for the Ministry and to get some new questions. It was kind of cool. That began the process which brought me here to this place. And Doug Watkins, Reverend Dr. Doug Watkins, back there in the back, said, "What can it hurt? Even if it's not for you, you will have spent a year finding out, and you will be in California." A bit over 5 years ago, this community was in flux, too. They held Sunday get-togethers at various different places, and I guess they were at the Catholic Campus Ministry Center then, hearing speakers, ministers, members, outside lecturers. And some of the congregation thought that was fine, that was enough. But then one day, the question shifted. And you stopped debating if you needed your own building, and instead started asking, how soon can we have our own building? You saw the need for a Unitarian Universalist congregation at the South Jersey Shore, and it became obvious. Your eyes were opened to a new question. As the saying goes, we need one another, and others are in need of us. When the questions are baffling, we need others to sit with. We need a place of acceptance. We need a place of peace and safety. It's real work, and it's the real journey. 242 years ago, John Murray told us to share kindness and love, and urged us to presence, to let our lights shine for those who are suffering. It's a big job. It's the real work of this congregation. Congratulations to our new members. You are welcome here, and now you are also part of that welcome. You are part of that light. Let us dwell together in peace. Let us seek truth in love and help one another. As I see it now, ministry is not lecturing, not arguing, but sharing hope, celebrating courage and feeling love. Ministry is calling attention, seeing the ruts, the stony self in need of release, finding new answers and new questions. And, as Sarah Morse Campbell wrote, moving boldly into the unknown. I'm thankful for this moment. I'm thankful for this day. I'm thankful for this life. Amen. And now our closing song is number 112, which is one that apparently you all know, but I don't know.